Well, hey there, kids, and welcome to another episode of Learn BMX Racing. You know, of all the many different subjects that I have taught people over the years, one universal truth that I have discovered is that terminology is the most important foundational thing to start with. If the students, that would be you, if you don't understand what the teacher, that's me, if you don't understand what the teacher's talking about, then the whole lesson is pointless, all right? So for this episode, we're going to start with some terminology. We're going to go over all of the pieces and the parts of a BMX race bike. We're going to use my 2019 Chase Edge, and we could start from the top and move to the bottom, or we could start from the bottom and move to the top, or we could start from the front and go to the back. I'm going to throw you all off. We're going to start in the middle. We're going to start in the middle, and we're going to go out from there. All right? Sound good? Let's get going. The blue metal structure here is the frame. The frame is the heart and soul of your bicycle. The frame is what everything else attaches to. Now, a majority of modern race bikes, like mine, use 60-61 aluminum tubing, which is almost as strong as steel, but far more lightweight. Now, back in the 70s, most bikes, especially the cheaper dime store bikes like Huffy and Murray, those were made of high-tensile steel. In the 80s, they started using 4130 Chromium Molybdenum, also known as ChroMoly, which is a steel alloy that is lighter and stronger than ordinary steel, but a lot heavier than aluminum. Now today, top-of-the-line BMX frames are made from carbon fiber, and there are even some custom frames made of titanium. So what are all these tubes and pipes and stuff on the frame called? Well, starting in the center, this vertical tube is called the seat tube or the seat post tube. Attached to the top rear of the seat post tube are a pair of tubes called the seat stays. Attached to the top front of the seat tube is the top tube. At the bottom of the seat tube is the bottom bracket. At the rear of the bottom bracket, there are a pair of tubes called the chain stays. And at the front of the bottom bracket is the down tube. Now, the four tubes which make up the stays, they converge at the rear of the bike in a pair of metal braces known as rear dropouts. And finally, at the front of the bike, the top tube and the down tube join at the head tube. So beneath the down tube, you can see that there is an extra piece of metal here, and it's called a gusset. Now, there are many different types of gussets. Some gussets are plates welded to all three tubes in a triangle shape. Other gussets are just a small bit of reinforcement like mine. So regardless of the style of gusset, they all serve the same purpose, to give some added strength and rigidity to the frame. And while we are looking at how these parts are welded together, I should also note the welds themselves. So quality bicycles use beaded welds like you see here. So these welds, they're pretty nice, but I have seen even better quality welds on custom bikes. For example, welds like these are pretty much flawless. But for a mass-produced bicycle, the welds on my bike are pretty good. This is an example of the kind of weld you do not want to see on your bicycle. And this chart gives you a good visual representation of what to look for when judging the quality of the welding. And one last bit of trivia about welding. You know why there are tiny holes in the ends of the seat and chainstays right here. These are to allow hot air to escape from the tubing when the welds are being done, so the heat doesn't cause the tubes to warp or bend. The cross tubes between the seat stays and the chainstays are called bridges. So you have a chainstay bridge and a seat stay bridge. Looking at a bike from the side, you'll notice the head tube, top tube, seat tube, and down tube form a triangle shape. And likewise, the stays and the seat tube also form a triangle. Now, befittingly enough, these are called the front triangle and the rear triangle. Now, if you look at BMX bikes from the 1970s and 1980s, you'll notice the triangles were much larger. For example, here is my 1988 Haro Master, and you can immediately notice how much taller the triangles are. The top tubes are not quite parallel with the ground, but they're angled far less than the top tube of the Chase Edge. And these older bikes, they had a taller seat post tube. So as a result, the top tube was perfectly horizontal or close to it. And the reason for this geometry change is because riding styles have changed. Okay, jumps have gotten a lot bigger, and riders use a technique called pumping to get through a series of jumps, and they need to compress their bodies much deeper on the bike. So reducing the geometric height of the triangles helps to facilitate this. Speaking of geometry, one of the things I appreciate about my Chase Edge is the cool geometry of the tubing itself. So all these really cool shapes are less about performance and more about branding. You know, each manufacturer is trying to stand out and give their products unique aesthetics. Daylight is a great example of an American BMX company with very unique shapes and beautiful geometric curves in their tubing. And TNT is another American frame with a unique design of splitting the base of their seat tube in two. They claim it gives added strength, but I just think it looks cool. And, you know, there are still many brands of bikes out there with plain circular tubing in their frames as well. And carbon fiber frames have extremely elegant flowing lines and variations in the shape and geometry of their tubing also. So at the top of the seat tube, we have the seat post clamp, then the seat post, and the seat. Seat post clamps squeeze the top of the seat tube around the seat post, so your seat post stays in place. Simple seat post clamps can have a single bolt in them. More heavy-duty clamps can have two bolts, and the clamp on my Chase is called a quick release, and this allows you to tighten and loosen the clamp without using tools. You simply pull this release lever and turn it to tighten or loosen the tension. Now, seat posts are usually simple tubes which are again made of ChroMoly, aluminum, or carbon fiber. Now at the top of the seat post, you have the connection to the seat. The two most popular types of seat attachments on BMX race bikes are rail seats and pivotal seats. Now these are easy to remember because rail seats use rails which allow the seat to slide forward and backward and angle up or down, whereas pivotal seats are only able to pivot up or down. So rail seats are adjusted using nuts on both sides of the rails. Pivotal seats only have a single adjustment point using an Allen key bolt, which is accessed through the top of the seat. Now, obviously, the seat itself has to match this attachment configuration, right? You can only use rail seats on rail seat posts, and you can only use pivotal seats on pivotal seat posts. Now, some racers like to use very small, lightweight plastic seats. Some people prefer larger and more comfortable seats. I am using the largest padded pivotal seat I could find, and frankly, it's still quite small. Pivotal seats tend to be a lot smaller than rail seats. So if you prefer a larger seat, you will need to stick with a rail seat and seat post. Now, remaining in the center of the bike, let's move down to the bottom bracket. The bottom bracket is this short tube where the seat tube, down tube, and chainstays all converge. Now, on many bikes, the bottom bracket has the serial number stamped on the bottom. So, if you can't find the serial number of your bike, that may be where it's hiding. Now, housed inside the bottom bracket, you have a pair of bearing shells on either side, and the bottom bracket bearings are what allow your cranks to spin in the bicycle. So there are two types of bottom bracket shells, threaded and press fit, and they are exactly what they sound like. Threaded bottom brackets have threads which are machined into the frame, and the bearing shell screws into them. Press fit frames have smooth tubing in the bottom bracket, and the shells simply get pressed into place. So my Chase Edge has a threaded bottom bracket. My old Haro Freestyle bikes use a press fit bottom bracket. All the parts of the spinny thing you put your feet on is called a crankset. So the crankset attaches in the bottom bracket. There are three types of cranks for bicycles: one piece, two piece, and three piece. These happen to be three-piece cranks. They are called three-piece cranks because they are literally three pieces. There's a left crank arm, a right crank arm, and those are attached to a center spindle, which is seated in the bottom bracket. At the end of the crank arms are the pedals. Now, there are two types of pedals used in BMX. There are flats and clipless. The clip pedals are like the pedals road bike riders use, where you have to wear special shoes which physically clip in to the pedals. Now, if you're a novice rider in BMX, you aren't even allowed to use clips, so you don't need to worry about those if you're just starting out. Flat pedals are ordinary pedals you use with regular sneakers, and these pedals on the Chase are flats. In fact, all of my pedals are flats. So the gear connected to the cranks is called a chainring. Now, note that this chainring attaches to the cranks using 4 bolts. Okay, on BMX bikes, most chainrings are either 4-bolt or 5-bolt rings. Now, sometimes the front gear of a bicycle is one solid piece slipped onto the back side of the crank arm. So when the gear is a solid piece like that, it's called a sprocket. So why would you use one type of gear over the other? Well, the biggest difference is the ease with which you can change them. In order to change a sprocket, you have to remove the entire crank arm. But in order to change a chain ring, you simply undo these 4 bolts. Now, as a BMX racer improves in their abilities, they often have a need to change their gearing. And since chain rings are a lot easier to swap out than sprockets, most racers prefer to use a chain ring. The chain ring on my Chase I have changed, and it is not the stock gearing which came with the bike. The Chase came with a 43T chainring, and I changed it to a 45T. Now, the 45T is literally the number of teeth in the gear. 43T has 43 teeth. 45T has 45 teeth. The brand of chainring is a Renin, and it's made from 7075 aluminum. My favorite feature of the Renin chainring is their threaded bolt holes. So most chainrings have smooth mounting holes, so they require a nut on the rear of the chainring bolts. But with the Renin threaded chainrings, you just need the bolt because the threads are machined into the chainring itself, which is a very clever design. That covers all the central parts of the bicycle. Now, since we're on the drivetrain, let's follow the chain back to the rear of the bike. So BMX race bikes typically use thin and lightweight chains. Chains and gearing come in two widths, 1/8 of an inch or 3/32 of an inch. Now, most BMX race bikes use 3/32 chains, which are the same type of chain you would find on a road bike. And to get the best fit, your chain and chainring widths should match. So in other words, if you have a 3/32 chain, you want a 3/32 chainring and cog. The chains typically come in two different styles. There's full length or half length. The chain on my bike is a full length chain. Half length chains are allegedly stronger, but their real advantage is on bikes with short rear dropouts because half length chains allow for a more precise adjustment to the length of the chain. So here, the chain is attached to another gear called a cog. Because the cog is so small and it has to endure a massive amount of torque, cogs are often made of ChroMoly or stainless steel, even on the lightest of racing bikes. Now, while the average chainring has 44 teeth, the average cog has 16 teeth. So if you hear people talk about the gearing on their bike and they say, oh, they're running 44/16, that's what they're talking about. So the cog is attached to the rear hub. The rear hub is a metal cylinder with a threaded rod inside of it called an axle, which bolts to the rear dropouts of the frame. The axle is embedded inside a pair of ball bearings, which are on both sides of the hub. So fanning off the flange of the rear hub are interlaced wires called spokes. Sometimes the spokes will not be interlaced and will just run straight off the hub without touching any other spokes. Those are called radial spokes. So whether the spokes are interlaced or radial, all the spokes eventually thread into tiny nuts called spoke nipples. The spoke nipples are inside circular metal bands called rims. Tires attach to the rims, and inside the tires are inner tubes, which are inflated with air and support your tires. Bicycle inner tubes can have two different types of valves, either Schrader valves or Presta valves. And it's important to know which kind of valve you have on your inner tubes because not all air pumps are compatible with both types of valves. So it's good to know if you're running Schrader or Presta. One part you can't see when the tires are on a bicycle is the rim tape. Rim tape is like a giant rubber band which lines the inside of the rim and protects the inner tube from being punctured by the spoke nipples. Average 20-inch bikes have 36 spokes on each wheel. Race bikes, like mine, sometimes have less. Case in point, my Chase has 32 spokes and my Haro has 48 spokes. Obviously, more spokes translates into a stronger but heavier wheel. Rims on BMX bikes are 20 inches in diameter, and that is why you often hear people calling this style of bicycle a 20-inch bike. Now, some rims are made of carbon fiber, but most rims are made of aluminum, and looking at a cross-section of the rims, we see two layers of metal that are reinforcing the structure. These are called double-walled rims because there is an inner wall on the bottom and an upper wall on the top. Now, years ago, most rims only had a single layer of metal, and obviously those were called single-wall rims. Double-wall rims make the rims stiffer and stronger and less likely to bend under lateral loads. Now, the vertical sides of the rim are called the sidewalls, and they are the part of your rim where the brake pads make contact to slow the spin of the wheel. There's also a curved lip on the inside of the rims. So bicycle tires contain a wire around each perimeter of their circumference called a bead. And when you inflate your bike tires, the air pressure causes this bead to lock itself into the lip of the rim so that the tire stays in place. Older BMX bikes had really wide rims, which allowed you to mount just about any tire you wanted. Now, modern BMX race bikes tend to have much skinnier rims, more like a road bike. And this means you need to be careful about the width of tire you mount on the bike. You can't go too wide, or you risk having the tire peel off the rim when taking a hard corner. So tires have a marking on them to tell you their exact sizes. In the United States, we usually use markings like this, 20 by 1.75, which tells you the tire is 20 inches in diameter and 1.75 inches wide. But to be very precise, you can match the ISO size to your rim. Now, the ISO size of my front rim is 406/16, and my rear is 406/17. Now, many people say your tire size should only be 1.5 to 2 times wider than the rim itself. So following that advice, that means my tires should be no wider than about 406/32s. So the tires I'm running right now are 406/47s. So these 1.75-inch tires are a few millimeters wider than suggested, but I've never had any problems with them. And again, that 1.5 to 2 times thing, those are just guidelines to let you know that you should be close to that. For a moment, let's return to looking at the rear axles. On my Haro back trail, you'll notice there are just a pair of nuts bolting the wheel to the dropouts. But on my Chase, there are 2 black contraptions on the outer side of the dropouts. Now, these are called chain tensioners and are used to help snug your chain in place when you're working on your bicycle. You see, in order to tighten a bicycle chain, you need to pull back on the tire while simultaneously tightening the 2 axle nuts. Now, since we only have 2 hands, that's not all that easy to do at the same time. So chain tensioners do exactly what their name implies. They allow a person to maintain tension on the chain while securing the rear tire in place. You do that by adjusting these silver bolts that you see on either side. As you tighten those, it pulls the tire back further away from the seat post and tightens up the chain. That covers just about all the parts on the rear of the bike, except one, the brakes. Now, starting this year, In 2020, disc brakes have become very popular. Many of the major BMX manufacturers like Chase, Haro, DK, and GT are all selling complete bikes with disc brakes. Now, my Chase doesn't have disc brakes. The brakes on my bike, they go by many different names. Technically, they are caliber brakes because they use a brake caliper. They are rim brakes because they stop the wheel by pressing rubber brake pads against the rim sidewalls. But the most accurate name for them are V-brakes. Now, while there are many styles of rim brakes used on BMX bikes, such as U-brakes and side calipers, the V-brakes are by far the most common and popular on racing bikes. V-brakes are popular because they are extremely powerful, yet very easy to adjust and maintain. So the components of V-brakes are the arms, the brake pads, the mounting bolts, the spring tensioners, and inside the arms are the springs themselves, which obviously provide the tension that allows the arms to move back into place after you've pulled the brake lever. The wire leading to the brakes is the brake cable, and the covering at the end is called the brake cable end cap. The pinch bolt holds the cable in place, and a rubber sleeve covers the cable before it goes into a curved bit of metal called a noodle. I know it's a goofy name for a bike part, but that's what it's called. It's called a noodle. So the sheath that is over the brake cable is called a cable housing. And inside of the housing is typically a liner of a slippery material like Teflon. And that's just to assure that the cable can slide freely inside. Now, my bike has 3 cable clips along the top tube to hold the cable in place. Now, different bikes have different ways of tidying up the cable. Cheap bikes, they might not have anything on the frame to use as cable guides. And more expensive bikes, they might route the cable housing inside the frame itself. So the brake cable connects to the brake lever, which is always mounted beneath the right-hand grip of the handlebars. And I have to say, of all the innovations in BMX technology in the last 30 years, the grips are one of my favorite improvements. And I know that sounds like a weird thing to be excited about, but back on my 1988 Haro Master, I had rubber grips, which simply slipped onto the handlebars. Now, the problem with those old style of grips was that the fit was so tight, you couldn't get the second grip on the bars because the immense air pressure trapped inside the bars would prevent the grip from going on. So you'd need to lubricate the grip with dish soap, or some people would poke a pinhole in the end of one of the grips to let the air out. Today, the grips have these simple clamp rings on either end, which tighten using an Allen wrench. So you easily slide the grip on, tighten these 2 bolts, and you're done. It's brilliant. It's so much easier. Now, the plastic cap at the end of the bars is called an end cap. And most BMX handlebars, they're very similar in shape. You know, they just have a curved shape with a crossbar in the middle for support. Now, these bars are made by TNT bicycles, and I really like them because the crossbar is oval instead of being perfectly round, which, makes them a little more aesthetically pleasing. I just kind of like the look of the TNT bars. Now, of course, you can't have a race bike without a number plate. And this plate Very popular plate, and it just attaches to the handlebars with simple Velcro straps, and it is running my 2020 district number of 57. The bottom part of the handlebars has a crosshatch pattern which is etched into the metal called knurling, and this provides some friction for the bike stem to clamp onto the bars and secure them in place. So this part of the bike is called the neck or the stem. And although this part of the bike looks simple, there's actually a lot of complicated stuff happening up here in the front of the bicycle. So the stem of a bicycle serves two purposes. Obviously, it secures the handlebars in place, but less obviously, it also secures the steerer tube, which runs up inside the head tube. Let's pause on the parts of the stem and head down to the fork, and we'll work our way back up. So the two tubes holding the front wheel in place are the forks. At the bottom of the forks, we have the fork dropouts. And just like the rear dropouts secure the rear wheel to the bike, the fork dropouts secure the front wheel. So I'm not going to discuss much about the front wheel because it is pretty much identical to the rear, except the hub is smaller because it doesn't have a cog attached to it. One of the most common mistakes that you will see on cheap bicycles assembled in discount stores is that the forks are mounted backward. This mistake is so common, I've actually seen drawings of bicycles where the forks are mounted incorrectly. So as the fork tubes meet at the top of the tire, they attach to a pipe called the steerer tube. Now, many BMX forks, they have a small hole drilled in the bottom of the steerer tube as a place to mount a side pull caliper brake. My 1988 Haro Master had a side pull front caliper called a Dicomp 883. These days, racing bikes don't usually have front brakes, but the brake hole is still included in many forks. Now you'll notice the front rim of this bike actually curves from one side to the other, and it really has no vertical sidewalls. So even if I wanted to put a front caliper brake on this bike, it wouldn't work unless I got a new front rim which had sidewalls. So seated inside the head tube is a set of two bearings known as a headset. Now, just like you have two bearings in your bottom bracket, one on the right and one on the left, you also have two bearings in your headset, one on top and one on the bottom. While the crank spindle rotates in the bottom bracket, the steerer tube rotates inside the headset. The cups which house the headset bearings are called races. Now on older bikes, the races were clearly visible. These silver parts are the top and bottom race of the headset on my 1988 Haro Master. These huge races on my Haro back trail are one of the largest and beefiest headsets you could buy, and the bearings inside are massive. Now you'll notice the head tube on my Chase, it flares out a little wider at the top and the bottom. So there are still races and bearings in the head tube of my Chase, but they are recessed inside the head tube. One of the major changes in fork designs from old school bikes to today is the change from threaded steerer tubes to threadless. Now, the name threadless is a bit of a misnomer, however. See, the so-called threadless tubes technically still have threads, but the threads are located inside the tube instead of on the outside. On older bikes, like my 1988 Haro Master, the top race of the headset had a huge threaded nut which you would tighten onto threads at the top of the steerer tube to hold the fork in the frame. Then you would attach the neck to the steerer tube using this wedge bolt, which would lock the neck inside the steerer tube. Okay, now threadless steerer tubes are a little different. On a threadless fork system, the threads are located inside the steerer tube, either using a star flange nut, or sometimes a threaded nut is actually welded in place, as it is on my Redline monster forks on my Haro Backtrail. So the way threadless forks are assembled, the steerer tube inserts into the headset, the stem slips onto the steerer tube and clamps down using these pinch bolts. Aluminum spacer rings are used to set the proper height of the stem. And the spacers allow you to make sure your pinch bolts on the stem are getting a solid grip on the steerer tube. Then finally, in the center of your stem, a top cap bolt gets tightened into the star nut. So my top cap happens to have this little rubber cover over it, so you can't see the top cap bolt. But there's still a top cap bolt hidden under there. Now, the head tube is, it's very unassuming, but you can see there's a lot of complicated stuff going on inside there. So most people don't change the stem or the forks on their bikes until they're much more knowledgeable and experienced. So if you're a beginner, you don't really need to remember all this right now, but it's just good to have a basic understanding of what kind of parts are hidden away inside your head tube. And last but not least, we get to the one thing that I skipped: the dice cap valve covers for the Innertubes. Dice caps first became popular back when I started riding freestyle BMX in the 1980s, and I have always thought that dice caps were awesome. I remember exactly where I was the first time one of my friends rode up to us with dice on his bike. I thought they were just brilliantly clever and creative, and ever since then, I have always run dice caps on my BMX bikes. Now, of course, if you're going to have dice caps, they need to match the color scheme of your bike, because that's just cool. So I have black dice on my Haro. I have blue dice on the Chase, right? This Haro has white dice. It all fits and just looks right. So that was an extremely long video, but if you watch the whole thing, you now know a lot more about the parts of a BMX race bike than any of your friends. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Learn BMX Racing. I hope you found it educational and informative, and now, when you look back over the years, you'll say, man, that video, I learned so much about the parts of my race bike. That was really cool. And remember, when you look back on this time, don't ever forget that your good old days are happening right now.